This is Tess Tucker reading from my original Daughter of a Dead Woman. Here we're in the middle of the Empire Strikes Back time period. I'm still, writing-wise, it's still not as good as what my current work is. This was published January 2013, so over a year ago. And still kind of campy, still me kind of trying to be funny, but we are going to be seeing some darker things here. It's just the characters that I want to improve and their reactions to things that I want to improve in the revised edition, and also the extent of what Leia knows about how she and Tess are related and how she figures it out, because it just doesn't seem very realistic. I also want to make their relationship more realistic. They throw around the word love, like, oh, but, I love Leia like a sister, and everybody's just like, oh, but they are sisters. But I want to make them really earn that emotional connection together before they even know. And that's something that I really want to improve on in the second one. But other than that, this, as it gets darker, it gets more fun to write, and I seem to get more into it, so we are getting better. It's not as campy as the first one. Anyway, this is Chapter 13, Millennium Falcon, 3ABY. Following a surprisingly easy escape through the asteroid field that conveniently destroyed the Imperial fighters without much effort on the Falcon's part, Han got the outrageous idea of landing inside one of the larger, more cavernous asteroids. Fortunately, Leia could talk him out of it. Tess wanted them out of the asteroid field so much that she didn't even call Leia out when the princess's main argument on getting out of there was that they had a kid on board and couldn't take such risks. They stayed on the asteroid just long enough to plug 3PO into the hyperdrive and for Tess to walk in on a make-out session between Leia and Han, after which she exasperatedly insisted that the two make up their minds between liking and hating each other. The second 3PO isolated the reverse power flex coupling, they were off. Tess woke up from a nap in one of the bunks on the Falcon and made her way to the cockpit with sleep lingering in her eyes. She immediately noticed the beautiful orange clouds. "Whoa," she whispered. She took her seat behind Chewbacca, who growled a good morning. "Where are we?" "Visiting one of Han's friends, apparently," Leia explained. "Well, that's guaranteed to go horribly." "Glad to see your nap hasn't affected your sarcasm, kid," Han spat, already annoyed with the landing operator. "No," he repeated into the system. "I don't have a landing permit. I'm trying to reach Lando Calrissian." Two blasts to the ship interrupted his sentence. Whoa, wait a minute, let me explain." "Well, that was sooner than expected," Tess mused. "I thought we had at least an hour before failure." As if on cue, they suddenly got granted permission to land. Tess hopped up between Leia and Han. "Can we all do code names again?" "No," the two of them said in unison. Chewbacca growled in agreement. "Come on," Tess begged. "The last time wasn't that bad. Everyone believes you guys were a married couple because you argue all the time. I passed for Leia's daughter." "If I had you when I was 8, Leia interjected. "Besides, Han knows this person. The only person who gets the code name is you, considering the Empire decided to go heavy on the advertising with the infamous kid who escaped the Death Star." "Ah, my bounty," Tess reminisced sarcastically. "All the crimes they came up with, thievery, deception, smuggling, all the way to murder of Imperial soldiers. How was someone going to believe that when my sketch made me look like I was 5 years old?" "Yeah, well, you still look like that," chuckled Han. Tess glared at him, then turned to Leia. "Come on, you make up a code name too. It's boring alone," Tess begged. "We could be sisters from Naboo. People always believe we're sisters. I'll be Inna again. What do you want your name to be?" "No, Tess," Leia insisted. "No code names for me. Same cover story as usual. You're Inni Organa, my cousin." "Sister," Tess demanded. "More embarrassing childhood stories to share." "Fine," Leia sighed, throwing her head back in mental exhaustion. "You're going to give me premature gray hairs, Tess." "Perfect. Then we'll have more fun when you do the married couple cover story because you'll finally look old enough." Chapter 14, Bespin, 3ABY. The orange clouds of the planet Bespin were even more magnificent than the art Tess had seen in some old books that her guardian Inni kept in their cottage in Dantooine. The group descended the Millennium Falcon's ramp, and suddenly it was as if they were part of the sky. Tess had never been to a planet like this before, unlike her well-traveled companions. "Oh, no one to meet us," 3PO pointed out. Tess glanced at the door expectantly before sensing Leia's unease. Then Tess herself felt her own surge of uncertainty that she couldn't explain. "I don't like this," Leia pointed out. "Me neither," agreed Tess. Han rolled his eyes and turned to face the two of them. Well, what would you like? Well, 3PO offered, they did let us land. Look, Han stated, looking between Leia and Tess. Don't worry, everything's going to be fine, trust me. Before Tess could list the many reasons Han had inadvertently given for them to distrust him, the door heading out to their landing platform swished open. See, Han said, nodding towards the door, my friend. Tess and Leia exchanged glances as Han approached the man who he claimed was his friend. The princess leaned over to Tess. Ina Organa, my sister, 14 years old, Leia reminded her. But if we can, let's try to leave out the last names. 16, Tess corrected. Leia gave her a look. Have fun getting someone to believe that. A great, friendly-sounding laugh came from Han Solo's old buddy, but something about him still didn't sit quite right with Tess. Leia seemed even more apprehensive. The two men hugged and sparked up a conversation immediately. Assuming now was a good enough time as any, Leia, Chewbacca, Tess, and 3PO caught up with Han and his old friend. Han's friend, Lando, Tess recalled, was a dark-skinned man with short, curly black hair. He was well-kept and well-dressed in a dark blue suit. His smile was large and friendly, but it changed when his eyes found Leia. Well, hello, what have we here? He said with a gentlemanly suave. Welcome, I'm Lando Calrissian. I'm the administrator of this facility. And who might you be? Leia, she replied, grinning modestly. Welcome, Leia, hummed the Calrissian. His words were definitely bordering seductive. Tess exchanged glances with Chewie, holding back a grin. Maybe it was because when all of her peers were experimenting with their teenage hormones, Leia was running for senator of Alderaan. Whatever the case, it always amazed Tess when fellow rebels, or any man for that matter, complimented Leia. Not because she didn't deserve the compliments, but because she was so surprised at them. Take Han, for example. He had obviously developed romantic feelings for Leia. That was 2 years ago. Seeing the banter between the princess and the smuggler, one might guess that Han was just wasting time with someone he knew he couldn't have. But Tess saw the inside view. Han saw through Leia. Han saw the woman who needed him there, but couldn't express it. The woman who used her work in the rebellion as an excuse not to drop all defenses and give love a chance. Tess knew better than anyone. Not only did she practically live with Leia for 3 years, but for a rebel who had been hiding from the rebellion since even before the Battle of Yavin, the princess had very few girlfriends to rant to, so the job fell to Tess. Once the group was settled into the elaborate room they were provided, Tess and Leia took the time to change out of their dirty jumpsuits into more appropriate attire. Leia fashioned her hair into 2 hoops of braids at the sides of her head and a small bun near the top. She wore an elegant red jumpsuit with long, flowing sand-colored vest. Tess wore a similar jumpsuit, but instead chose a teal one. Leia helped her tame her curls so she could wear her hair mostly down, as she liked it. They were grateful to have a place to freshen up after seeing how elegant everyone looked on Cloud City compared to their fresh out-of-it escape from the Empire grunginess. Tess found herself on the verge of twiddling her thumbs, sitting restlessly on the white couch in the room the group was provided. Leia returned from a walk around the facility. Still no sign of 3PO? Tess asked. Leia shook her head and began pacing about the room. In all honesty, she was kind of glad the droid had disappeared, or else he would eminently end up as her babysitter. He'll turn up, Tess assured the princess. Leia sighed and collapsed on the couch beside Tess. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, she began. But I have a weird feeling about this place, and 3PO going missing definitely isn't helping. Tess nodded absent-mindedly. She had a bad feeling about this place, too. She couldn't explain why, but Tess knew that these intuitions that she and Leia sometimes had were almost always right. Those feelings were most unwelcome now, though, because it was the first time in a long time that things seemed good. Leia had not been too overprotective. Tess was enjoying looking out the windows and reading information available on such a beautiful planet as Bespin, and most surprisingly, Han and Leia were getting along, even sharing a kiss here and there. Tess liked to imagine that one day she, Leia, Han, and Luke and Chewbacca would eventually calm down with their adventures at least a little. She could see Han and Leia getting married and having a kid or two, Luke furthering his Jedi training, and Chewbacca tagging along like some crazy uncle. It would just be nice to have somewhere to come home to. Still, Tess often wondered where her place would be in that scenario. She had the same kind of questions with Uncle Bill. Why did he even keep her around? What was she to him? She knew he loved her, but what made him take care of her in the first place? Now she was thinking the same things about Leia, Han, and Luke. Leia? Tess asked tentatively. The princess looked over in response. Why? Um, Her voice trailed off as she second-guessed the question she wanted to ask. I was wondering, I noticed the information systems here seemed pretty extensive. Would you be okay if I used them to try and figure out where I came from? Tess bit her lip in anticipation of the answer. Leia was definitely caught off guard by the question. I don't want to leave you and Han and Luke, Tess added quickly. I swear, I always wondered if I had any family left, you know? You were adopted, don't you ever think about that? I used to, Leia admitted. Every once in a while, especially when I was around your age. I really needed a mother, and since my adoptive one had died, my father, your Uncle Bill, he told me about my birth mother. He even showed me some information on her, answered some questions. It helped to know where I came from, but I was lucky. How so? Asked Tess. 'Cause my birth mother was an amazing person, Leia explained. That would have been a much more damaging experience if she was some thief or criminal who couldn't deal with the kid. Tess shuffled uncomfortably in her chair. Leia was obviously holding something back, and Tess was anxious to hear it. Uncle Bill said that the Naberrie family was a family he knew. Tess brought up cautiously. Did you know them? Tess could tell she hit the nail on the head where Leia's restraint was concerned. Whatever the princess was neglecting to tell her, she had just asked the perfect question to figure it out. Not officially, Leia explained carefully. But in a way, yes. The princess took a deep breath. She met eyes with Tess and took her hand. Tess, maybe I should have told you this earlier, but my biological mother was in the Naberrie family. We're actually related. Tess scanned Tess's eyes as she took in the news. How long have you known? Tess wondered aloud. Since the moment I saw you, Leia told her with a grin, squeezing her hand. But officially, when I saw you'd written down a list of names from the Naberrie family, and I just put two and two together. So, we're like cousins or something? Asked Tess, still taking this all in. She didn't feel very attached to the situation. It was almost as if it was happening to someone else. Tess always thought that her mother's name being Padme Naberrie was just a coincidence, some woman with the same name as the former queen and senator. But as Leia said it, somehow Tess knew it to be true. Something like that, Leia said with a nod. She leaned forward and gave Tess a kiss on the forehead. But you know I love you like a sister, no matter who Padme Naberrie was to your mother. Tess straightened up in surprise. Wait, Padme Naberrie was your mother too? Tess blurted. Leia's face twisted in confusion. What do you mean? Leia asked. You were told your mother was Padme Naberrie? That's impossible. How is it impossible? Tess questioned. She tried not to show it, but Leia's comment was like a kick in the gut. Was she lied to about her mother's identity all this time? Leia frowned in sympathy for the 14-year-old, squeezing her hand again. Tess didn't notice, but her eyes started to form tears. Leia wiped one off her cheek. Tess, the princess began carefully, Padme Naberrie was my mother, but she died soon after giving birth to me. That was 8 years before you were born. Tess's eyes seemed to gaze off a mile away. Leia wrapped the girl in a hug. I don't know why my father told you that was your mother's name, Leia began softly, holding Tess. But I promise you we'll figure this out. I know you're my family, Tess. I can feel it. That will never change, no matter what we find. Leia then pulled away from the hug and took Tess's face in her hands. As soon as we leave, I'll contact everyone I know who might be able to help, if that's what you want, Leia promised. Is it? This was all just too much for Tess. She didn't understand it. A part of her was begging for answers. Another part of her was left in the dark. She found herself rising to a stand. I'm going for a walk. Tess went on a walk to be with nothing but her thoughts, but surprisingly enough, no thoughts came. Her mind was just blank as she shuffled through the white halls of Cloud City. Suddenly, Tess snapped into alertness when her ears caught one of the voices she most feared. She had only heard it once, but somehow she knew the heavy, mechanical breathing and the deep, demanding voice was Darth Vader's. She immediately put her ear to the door. In exchange for finding Skywalker's friends, said Vader,
I have given Boba Fett permission to take Solo and retrieve his bounty with Jabba the Hutt on Tatooine. He needs the smuggler alive. Any torturing to lure Skywalker will have to be minimal.
What about the princess? Asked an unfamiliar voice. Tess could feel her heart pounding in her throat. If some other part of her didn't take over after realizing how important this conversation was to her and her friends, she probably would have gotten sick right there.
I have interrogated this princess before, responded Vader.
Chills crawled all over Tess's arms.
She is extremely resistant and has somehow learned to shield her thoughts from the reading and manipulation through the Force. I sense nothing of her even when sharing the same room. I fear young Skywalker may not sense anything from her either if she is in pain. Now the child with them, the one that escaped the Death Star, she might be the perfect target. I have an officer in my establishment that suggests this girl was some sort of creation rather than a child born. In the processes of testing her, he has agreed to begin with the pain-related processes to most effectively bring Skywalker here.
Tess's breath nearly stopped. She knew the moment Vader said it that the officer interested in her was Chid, her former guardian. Tess's brain told her to run and tell the others before it was too late, but her feet wouldn't let her move. What if this officer is right? Began yet another unfamiliar voice. And the child is a creation, but it turns out she is some kind of inhuman. What if this means Luke Skywalker will not sense her? A robotic voice jumped in.
Though I need Solo alive as long as I can supervise, I will allow him to be tortured less extensively to ensure you get what you came for, Lord Vader. Your help is appreciated, Boba Fett,
Vader replied. Tess, what are you doing? Asked a familiar voice. Tess's glance darted up, startled to see Lando Calrissian standing over her. Nothing! Then Tess froze. You called me Tess. I told you my name was Inna. Calrissian's face tensed up. Suddenly, he grabbed Tess around the waist and clapped a hand over her mouth. Tess kicked and screamed as best she could. She tried to bite his hand, kick his shin, something. Tess's heart practically stopped when Lando Calrissian opened the door she had been listening through, and Tess found herself face to face with Darth Vader. Chapter 15. Leia Organa paced about the white room, her tan vest flowing behind her. Her sense that something was off about Cloud City was skyrocketing. Han entered the room for the first time since that morning. "Where have you been?" Leia demanded. "Something is seriously wrong here. Tess has been missing for almost 3 standard hours. We haven't seen 3PO since we arrived, and no one has seen or heard anything about either of them." Considerably calmer than the princess, Han took her gently by the shoulders and gave her a kiss on the forehead. "Calm down a minute," he said softly. "Did Tess just leave out of the blue, or did she go for a snack?" "Well, Leia began awkwardly, keeping in mind that she hadn't gotten the chance to tell Han about her familiar ties to Tess. Now wasn't the best time to bring that up. "We did have a bit of an emotional conversation." "See," Han assured her, as if it was the solution. "She's a teenager. She needed some time. I'm sure she'll be back soon." Just then, Chewie walked in with a wine. He held a plasteel bin full of C-3PO's disassembled form. "You found him in a junk pot?" Han asked Chewie, taking a look at the golden remains. "Oh, what a mess," Leia sighed. "Chewie, do you think you can repair him?" Chewie growled an affirmative response. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," said Lando Calrissian from the doorway. Leia gave Han a look, hoping he took the hint not to ask Lando for any favors with the droid or otherwise. "Not really," Leia told him unconvincingly. He walked up to the princess. "You look absolutely beautiful," he told her. "You truly belong with us here among the clouds." "Thank you," Leia said flatly. "Have you seen my sister Inna by any chance?" Han looked confused for a moment. He was so bad at sticking to the code names when they had them. He forgot everyone so easily. "Yes," Lando informed her. "I saw Inna on the way over here and invited her to dinner, as I was planning to do with all of you as well. She's waiting in the dining hall, if you would care to join us." Seeing Lando offer Leia his arm, Han came to the other side of her so the princess could take his arm instead. Lando managed to take a hint and lead the way rather than escort the princess. Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and Lando made casual conversation as they neared the dining hall. Somehow the subject of the rebellion and the Empire came up, and Han asked why Lando was so sure that they were protected. Leia noticed Lando tense up a bit before his response. "I just made a deal that will keep the Empire out of here forever," he said shortly. At that, he opened the door to the dining hall. Darth Vader stood at the head of the dinner table, with his black-gloved hand around Tess's neck. Boba Fett stood menacingly in the corner, and several stormtroopers surrounded them. Adrenaline rushed through Leia's veins as she snatched Han's blaster. After 3 perfectly aimed but force-blocked shots right at Vader's head, the Sith used the Force to bring the blaster to him. Leia's heart stopped when he put Han's gun to Tess's head.
"We would be honored if you would join us,"
Vader said smoothly. Han and Leia looked at each other. Then Leia glared at Lando with nothing but hatred. "I had no choice," he explained, mostly looking at his old friend Han. "They arrived right before you did. I'm sorry." The door closed behind them. They were trapped in this room with some of the most dangerous people in the galaxy. Leia lunged forward towards Lando and could have easily choked him to death if Han did not hold her back. He wrapped both arms around her, not just to restrain her, but to comfort her. Angry tears formed in Leia's eyes. "Now's not the time," Han whispered. "We'll get out of this." Leia's heart broke as she glanced back at Tess, whose hands were tied in front of her. The 14-year-old mouthed sorry, tears streaming down her cheeks. Leia nearly broke down into tears, shaking her head, hopefully communicating that it was not her fault. Then the princess turned to Lando with a cold glare. "If anything happens to her," she muttered through clenched teeth, "have no doubt in your mind that your life will end within a day."
"Such passion, princess, for nothing but a rebel teenager,"
Vader mused. He removed the handcuffs restraining Tess, then pushed her over to a familiar-looking Imperial officer. Tess looked absolutely terrified.
"Now," continued the Dark Lord, "please take your seats. We have business to discuss."
Chapter 16. Tess could hardly breathe with Darth Vader's cold, gloved fingers grasping her forehead. The dursteel bounds around her wrists and ankles sent chills up her limbs.
"Astonishing,"
Vader mused.
"as if someone has replicated her signature and placed it inside."
"I find it sickening," Chid disagreed. "The creation of unnatural life just to trick you, Lord Vader. If I may say so, my lord, remember that the child is not her child, but an inhuman use of her against her will. An abuse of the deceased. An abomination."
"Of course,"
Vader agreed.
"but still, scientifically astounding."
Vader finally removed his hand from Tess's forehead.
"When we depart, she will be taken to the Emperor himself by his own request. I have provided you with the ITO interrogator if you wish to make use of it, but as long as we bring Skywalker here and the child can stand in front of the Emperor, your job will be heavily rewarded, Admiral Deltrod."
"Yes, my lord," Chid said with a bow. As soon as Vader left the room, Chid stood over her with a malevolent grin. Tess felt frozen solid. Leia had told her that she was a victim of the ITO interrogator on the Death Star. She wouldn't talk about it much, but Tess could tell it was a traumatizing experience, even for someone as strong as Leia. Chid grabbed Tess under the chin, forcing her to look at him. "Let's see how much pain the science experiment can take." Leia practically threw herself into the door of her holding cell. Her shoulders heaved with anger and hatred for all the people who thought it was okay to torture her friends and leave her here to listen to their screams as her own form of torture. The princess propelled herself into the door again. By now, Leia's shoulder was severely bruised, but she didn't even feel it. Deep down, she knew there was no way she could get through that door, but she needed to do something. Anything. A kind Wookiee growl and a friendly paw on her shoulder turned her around. Still fuming, Leia looked up at Chewbacca. He was sedated, so after having a reaction similar to Leia's, he was so worn out that he could only manage fiddling with a broken 3PO. "Who in their right mind tortures a 14-year-old? Leia said softly. Chewie growled a sympathetic response just as Han was shoved into the room. Han's eyes were wide and bloodshot, and his skin seemed several shades paler. He was so weak that Chewbacca and Leia had to keep him from falling over. "I feel terrible," he muttered. His eyes didn't seem to connect with anything properly. They swung all over the place as if he was trying to figure out which direction to look. Chewbacca and Leia helped him over to the hard Durasteel bed. Once Han was on the bed, Chewbacca returned to the pieces of 3PO and Leia stroked Han's hair. She winced at the sound of another one of Tess's screams. "They never even asked me any questions," Han breathed. He reached a hand towards Leia's. He looked into her eyes for a moment. "I'll die before I let them take her. I promise." Holding back tears, Leia leaned forward to give Han a kiss on the head. Just then, the door to their cell opened. Leia's temper fumed when she saw Lando enter the room. "Lando," she sneered. The princess helped Han sit up. Chewie growled menacingly. "Get out of here, Lando," Han spat. "You sick bastard. What are you getting at torturing a kid?" "Just shut up and listen," Lando snapped. "Vader has agreed to turn Leia and Chewie over to me." Leia's heart sunk. "With you?" Han questioned. "What about Tess and Han?" Leia asked, afraid of the answer. "Vader's giving Han to the bounty hunter," Lando explained. "He wouldn't tell me what he wanted with the kid." "Vader wants us all dead," Leia pointed out, frustrated and confused as to why all this was happening. "He doesn't want you at all," said Lando, his anger rising. "He wants the kid, and he's after somebody called a Skywalker. Lord Vader set a trap for him." Suddenly it all made sense. This was all to Lord Luke to Vader. "And we're the bait," Leia put together. "But I still don't get why Vader would want Tess. She's 14 years old." "I don't know," Lando admitted. "To be honest, the way he talked about her, I was expecting some sort of clone, maybe even a human-like droid. They kept calling her a creation, like a science experiment." With a burst of effort and a bit of help from Leia, Han pushed himself to a stand. "Well, she's not," Han spat. "She's a human kid who you're responsible for torturing. You fixed this up so good, didn't you, my friend?" At that, Han threw a punch right at Lando's jaw. The officers who came in with Lando started hitting Han with blunt sticks, and Leia took the chance to grab one of their blasters and point it right at Lando's head. Unfortunately, she was grabbed from behind, and one of the officers forcefully bent her arm behind her, taking the gun and shoving it hard into her back. "Stop!" Lando ordered, composing himself and fixing his blue cape. "I've done all I can. Sorry I couldn't do more, but I've got my own problems." "Yeah," Han muttered, letting Chewbacca help him up. "You're a real hero." The officer holding Leia still had not let go. "I meant what I said earlier," Leia called after Lando. "I said that if you hurt her, I'd kill you. I will!" Leia fought hard against the officer's grasp, so hard that despite Han, Chewie, and even Lando's protests, he was forced to knock her unconscious with the back of the gun. Chapter 17. Tess couldn't even scream anymore. Her body seemed to melt inside itself, burning in the process, hitting every possible nerve as her bones transformed into lava, peeling through her skin. She looked down at her arms. The lava was beginning to burn through, or so it appeared. In her mind, Tess knew that the drugs injected into her were making her hallucinate while feeling this pain, but in the moment that didn't matter. All she really knew was that it was the worst pain she had ever felt. Tess's mouth hung wide open, gasping for air as the burning rose to her throat. She assumed this was the grand finale because the droid had been dismissed. Chid still looked down on her with that slight grin. He was saying something, but Tess couldn't make it out. The lava entered her ears. Then after she thought she couldn't scream anymore, the burning hit her brain and Tess cried out in horror. Finally, as Tess exhaled, the burning seemed to gush out. Overwhelmed with relief, Tess allowed herself several deep breaths, hoping they would have the same effect. Tess's body was soaked with sweat. Her wrists and ankles were bruised and bleeding. She even suspected one wrist was broken from the seizure-like jolts she experienced as part of her senseless torture. "Very interesting," Chid chuckled, as if the effects of the torture were funny. "Most normal human beings would have passed out 4 or 5 times throughout the treatment, even with the injection to keep you conscious. But you managed to stay awake the whole time." He pressed something that released Tess's wrists and ankles from the Durasteel bounds and ordered her to get up. "We have an event to go to." Tess could feel everything and nothing. She felt Chid's coarse hands on her shoulders. She felt the cold Durasteel bounds on her wrists. She felt the hard ground beneath her feet. Yet Tess's mind was silent. After what seemed like a mile-long walk through the white halls, Chid and Tess finally arrived at their destination, a black door. A harsh red glow emerged when it opened. Tess felt Chid's breath on her ear.
"Unless you want this reunion cut short," he murmured darkly, "I would not mention a word about our adventure with the little black droid. We don't want to interrupt your friend's encasement in carbonate, do we?" Normally, the notion of one of Tess's friends getting hurt would stop her heart, but either the shock of the torture or the drugs used during it had left her emotionally numb. As if her body was trying to fight back against the numbness, a single tear dripped down Tess's cheek. The room was dark, a drastic contrast to the white halls of the rest of the building. The center of the room was a hole in the floor, and the rest was structured like an arena around that hole. Across the room, Tess's eyes found Han, Leia, and Chewie. Seeing her friends slapped the girl back into reality. During the torture she experienced, a part of her was sure of imminent death. She wasn't sure if she would ever see her friends again. Suddenly, a shove on Tess's shoulder nearly knocked her over. She turned around and looked at Chid in response. "You may go say goodbye," he permitted, giving Tess a less forceful nudge in her friend's direction. Chewbacca was the first to catch Tess's eye. He let out a friendly Wookiee growl, alerting Han and Leia's attention to her. Approaching her friends, Tess began a sort of stumble, which turned into a full run until she found herself in their arms. Since all 4.5, the half being the severed 3PO on Chewie's back, were not physically restrained at the moment, the stormtroopers watched them carefully. "I'm so sorry," Tess muttered through sobs. "I'm sorry. I heard them talking. I could have stopped this all from happening. We could have gotten away and none of this would have happened." "Hey, listen," Han said with a gentle sternness. "Don't you ever think that, okay? I got a bounty on my head. I'm the one who dragged you all into this." Leia clearly wanted to protest with saying it was not his fault either, but Tess could see that she held herself back at the risk of implying that a part of the situation still was Tess's fault. Chewbacca managed to separate Tess from the group embrace and get his own hug, lifting her off her feet as he did so. She smiled up at her Wookiee friend and squeezed his furry paw. Finally, Tess turned to Leia. As soon as their eyes met, it was as if she knew what had happened. Leia knew the look of someone who had been through what she had been through on the Death Star 3 years ago. Tess knew from the moment she saw her friends that Leia would somehow be able to tell, but it still broke her heart that the princess had to relive her experience, especially now that Tess knew what that felt like. Leia wrapped her arms around Tess and held her close, resting her chin on the girl's head. "It's okay," the princess kept whispering. "You're with us now. You're safe. Tess, everything's going to be fine." But everything was not going to be fine. They surely had not come to the carbon freezing chamber for a family reunion. As the stormtrooper approached Han and placed handcuffs on him, it became clear to Tess who the victim of the carbon freezing would be. As if just now realizing what was going to happen, Chewbacca threw his arms up in protest with a deep, angry growl. He knocked over 2 stormtroopers before Han could pacify him. "Chewie! Chewie, this won't help me!" Han insisted. He paused a moment to let the Wookiee settle down and allow the stormtroopers to handcuff him. "The princess, the kid, you have to take care of them." Chewbacca sadly looked at Leia, Tess, then back at Han. "You hear me?" The Wookiee managed to nod. Next, Han's eyes came to Tess. Though his hands were restrained, Tess threw her arms around him anyway. "See you later, kid," he muttered into her hair. Then he pulled away and let his eyes meet hers again. "Don't look at me like that. This ain't goodbye forever." Tess nodded, tears falling down her cheeks. She hugged Chewie's arm as Han moved to Leia. The two just stared at each other for a moment, then emotions swelled and they simultaneously leaned into a passionate kiss. Tess could see tears in Leia's eyes. The kiss only ended when a stormtrooper pulled Han away, leading him backwards into the hole in the floor where he was to be frozen in carbonate. Suddenly, Leia stepped forward. "I love you," she blurted. Han responded as if he had known for years that she would say those 3 little words in that exact moment. "I know." And in that moment, Han Solo looked like the bravest man in the world. The pain in his face was not caused by the fear of his own fate, but the fear of his friends. He descended into the glowing red hole in the floor with bravery and dignity, and only when the smoke rose did he show his true pain, which would be frozen in carbonate for as long as he remained encased. A magnet pulled the statue of their tragic hero from the depths. After he was fully emerged, the carbonate crashed to the ground, making Tess and Leia jump. Tess glanced over at the broken-hearted princess. She wished, more than anything, that she could ease her friend's pain. Tess watched as Han's encasement was inspected. Lando Calrissian revealed to Darth Vader that Solo was indeed alive and in perfect hibernation. After that, he approached the prisoners. Leia jerked away from Lando's hand on her arm.
Calrissian, boomed the Dark Lord. Take the princess and the Wookiee to my ship.
You said they would be left in the city under my supervision, Lando protested. I thought you only wanted the kid.
I'm altering the deal, Vader returned. Pray I do not alter it again.
The dark mask then turned to Admiral Chid Deltrod.
Admiral, you will continue the procedure and report back to me when finished, at which time we will present these findings to the Emperor.
Tess and her friends did not entirely process what Vader had instructed Admiral Deltrod to do until he was dragging her away. No! No, please! Tess cried, fighting against him. Leia lunged forward to free Tess from the Admiral, but she only managed to grab Tess's hand before the princess was pulled back by a stormtrooper. Let her go! Leia screamed. She's been through enough of your sick torture! She's 14! Please, take me instead! Anything! She held on to Tess's hand for dear life. It took 3 stormtroopers to finally separate them, allowing Chid to drag Tess off. Feeling Leia's hand slip from her fingers, Tess's hope went with it. No! Tess shouted, flailing in the Admiral's arms, making it as difficult as possible for him to get her out of that room. Still, he managed to do it.
Your offer is tempting, Princess,
Vader mused.
After all, we enjoyed ourselves significantly during your last visit, but you aren't capable of supplying what this thing is.
At that, Darth Vader spun around, his cape falling behind him, and stalked out of the room. She's a person, Vader! Leia shrieked. No matter what you tell yourself to validate this cruelty, she's real! Tess held on to those last 3 words, hoping that the harder she grasped, the higher the likelihood that they would eventually be proven true. She is real. I am real. Still, as Tess was pulled into the room she was tortured in less than an hour ago, no doubt to be treated like a science experiment gone wrong yet again, those words became harder and harder to believe. Chapter 18. Luke Skywalker kept his blaster close as he surveyed the area around the corner. R2 followed close behind, rolling along almost playfully. Cloud City was a big place, and every hall looked the same. Luke reached out through the Force to guide him to his friends, but each trail led him in different directions. The emotions coming from them were so intense that he could not depict whose pain he was sensing. Suddenly a rush of agony fell over him. Someone else's pain and fear. It was overwhelming. If the pull had any sort of source, it would be the door that was directly in front of Luke. The aspiring Jedi raised his blaster before attempting to open the door. Locked. Luke could feel there were people in there, but he could not hear them. Carefully, he scanned the perimeter. R2, he asked the droid. Can you spike the security system? R2 beeped an affirmative answer, and within minutes the door opened. The emotions Luke felt behind that door spiked once the room was actually in view. The smell of blood caught in Luke's throat. He coughed and covered his nose and mouth with his sleeve. The room was nothing but a metal bed with durasteel wrist and ankle bands attached to it. Other than that, an ITO interrogator droid had plugged itself into the left wall. On the right side of the bed, a man dressed in the uniform of an Imperial officer lay face down on the floor. Luke felt something dark deep in his gut. Slowly, he took the man by the shoulder and turned him onto his back. Luke gasped and stumbled backwards. The man's jaw had been torn completely off, leaving a pool of blood still gushing around his unsported tongue. The loss of blood had obviously killed the man. The severed jaw was about 3 paces away. Remembering the interrogation droid behind him, Luke figured this was done as some sort of torture. He shook his head at the cruelty, especially considering those droids normally belonged to the Empire. I didn't mean to, came a small voice. Luke swiveled in the direction of the sound, instinctively readying his blaster. Then the warmth of a familiar Force signature overcame him. He neared the dark corner and proved his Force sense had identified the other presence correctly. Tess? He called softly. The 14-year-old was huddled in the corner as if trying to push herself as far away from the room as possible. She hugged her knees with shaking hands and shook her head repeatedly. I didn't mean to, she repeated, her eyes tearing up. I didn't mean to. Tess met Luke's eyes for a moment, then she returned to her blank stare. The soon-to-be Jedi took another scan around the room and began to piece the events together. That, plus his visions on the Dagobah system, told the story. Or at least part of it. A Jedi was not to turn on a path of anger, but looking at the ITO interrogator droid and knowing they had used it on 14-year-old Tess got him pretty damn close. Luke did not know what the Empire wanted with the girl, if anything. He'd already sensed this was a trap for him, and if they had tortured Tess for that purpose, Luke would never forgive himself. Knowing that he still had friends to help, Luke gently moved to take Tess's hand. At first she shivered and pulled away. Then when he tried again, she did not fight it. "Tess, it's me," Luke assured her. Still minding her state of shock, he slipped one hand under her legs and the other behind her back, lifting her off the ground with ease. Leia, Chewbacca, and the disheveled 3PO on the Wookiee's back were escorted towards the landing platform that held Vader's ship. Leia observed her surroundings. With Lando, an Imperial officer, and several stormtroopers surrounding them, even with Chewie's help it would be impossible to attempt an escape. Leia's mind raced. If she'd seen Luke now, it was just a matter of waiting. Luke was smart. He probably knew it was a trap before she yelled it down the hallway like a madwoman while simultaneously getting dragged away by an officer. Still, Luke had been implying for months now that facing Darth Vader was an eminent task for him. Leia had no idea whether his intentions were to try and save them directly or to do that by defeating Vader. Either way, though Leia's faith in Luke was strong, there was little chance of success. The Empire had been extra tricky this time and had come prepared with enough reinforcements to wrangle 30 prisoners. Suddenly, numerous officers in blue seemed to appear out of nowhere, wielding blasters. Leia's instincts sent her hand down to her belt for her own blaster, but of course she was a hostage and therefore had been disarmed. Only when Lando started pulling away the stormtroopers' weapons did Leia process that these officers in blue were not enemies, or at least they shared a mutual enemy with her. Leia exchanged glances with Chewie, then watched Lando Calrissian order his officers to take the stormtroopers away. Her hatred for the man overpowered her relief of disarmed captors. The traitor threw gasoline on her anger fire by pushing 2 blasters into her hands as if they were suddenly on the same team. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, talking over him as he began to uncuff the Wookiee. "We're getting out of here," Lando said simply. Leia fumed. Torturing your friends was not something that disarming a stormtrooper would fix, and assuming that Chewbacca would not feel the same way was even more idiotic of him. "Do you seriously think that after what you did to Han the Wookiee—" Leia was interrupted by an angry Chewbacca growl as the 7-foot Wookiee grabbed Lando's neck. The princess was actually relieved. She would have done the same thing with the provided physical strength. She ignored 3PO's cries to trust Lando for their freedom's sake. Leia was completely on Chewie's side in this. Through broken breaths, Lando muttered something about trying to help and having no choice. "Oh, we understand, don't we, Chewie?" Leia taunted. "He had no choice." Leia was about ready to let the Wookiee kill Lando before she heard Han's name. "What?" Leia asked. Chewie must have heard it too because his grip loosened just the slightest bit.
"We still have a chance to save Han," Lando gasped. "At the east platform."
Leia hesitated to believe him. "And Tess?"
"I'll take you to the room she's being held in," Lando promised. "But they were planning on her being there for a few more days. Our only chance to save Han is now."
The princess looked up at Chewie. Within seconds they were racing off in that direction. Fortunately, the east platform was close. Blasters in hand and Lando trailing close behind as if he was invited, Leia padded the exit to the platform just in time to see the ship fly away. The man she loved went with it. Leia, Chewie, and Lando approached the door to one of the torture rooms with the utmost caution. Though they did not hear anything from where they were standing, there was still a good chance that the Admiral was in the room with Tess. R2, who Leia assumed had arrived with Luke and caught up to them around the east platform, informed the others that the door was unlocked. "What?" Lando said in disbelief. Expecting the droid to be wrong, Lando tried to pad the door open. He was surprised when it worked, but even more surprised and unprepared for what he saw inside. Leia and Chewbacca caught up with him from behind, sharing a glimpse of the unoccupied torture room. Both of their heads slowly turned to Lando. "She was supposed to be here," Lando protested in his own defense. "They couldn't have taken her anywhere else." Leia pushed past Lando to further inspect the room. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of a shiny black droid plugged into the wall.
"And now, Your Highness, we will discuss the location of your hidden rebel base."
The princess shook away that memory. She could not allow that to distract her now. Tess was in trouble. Leia approached the Durasteel restraint bed. Intuition told her that Tess was indeed here at one point. Chewie, who had been inspecting the room as well, called Leia over with a growl. There, in front of the Wookiee, was a dark pool of blood. It was nearly dried and almost invisible above the floor's dark gray color. Once again, all eyes turned to Lando. "Where else could they have taken her?" Leia demanded, her words slow and dark. Lando ran his hands through his hair. "I don't know. I don't know," he muttered. "They must have taken her away on one of their ships somehow. I just checked with Lobot, my chief administrator, and all other holding cells are taken up by stormtroopers we apprehended." Chewie erupted into an angry growl, throwing Lando against the wall. "You're mad at the wrong person!" Lando shouted, picking himself up. "Really?" Leia spat, crossing her arms over her chest. "Because last time I checked, you were the traitor here." The Baron Administrator stomped over to Leia, clearly fed up with being treated like an enemy. "A traitor who has been helping you as of 5 minutes ago," he reminded her, "and a traitor who knows that we're all going to be blasted to pieces by Imperial troops unless we get out of here. Fast." "What about Tess?" Leia demanded. "There's nothing we can do for her here," Calrissian insisted. Leia felt absolutely helpless. As if having to put her trust in a traitor wasn't enough, both attempts to save their friends had failed. Though Luke was quite capable of taking care of himself, Leia had not seen him and was growing worried. Still, if Lando was right about the troops, they needed to get to the Falcon. And fast. Though Leia would rather die than give him the satisfaction of hearing it from her, Lando was right about the Imperial troops. Fortunately, they were no match for R2. He managed a cloud of smoke to blur their target vision, allowing Lando, Leia, Chewie, and the helpful little droid to make it to the Millennium Falcon. Lando and Leia led the others aboard, but they stayed outside the ship with their blasters to get rid of any remaining troops that might prevent them from taking off. Leia's aim was even better than her usual 9 out of 10 blaster accuracy when fueled by the thought that one of those stormtroopers laid a hand on Tess. She had no clue of what they did to Tess or why, besides the ITO, and she feared that was not the only torture the girl had to suffer through. Leia could still hear the screams in her head. Tess's and Han's. The piercing screams of pain that she could not stop. Lando's voice snapped Leia out of her vengeful haze. "Leia!" he called from across the ramp. "Go!" Leia shook her head and returned to blasting the troops away. And not just because she would rather kiss a hut than take orders from Calrissian. They were going to pay. Those corrupted, white robots of the Empire's demands would be destroyed for thinking that they had the right to harm a 14-year-old girl and encase a man in carbonate. "Leia!" Lando called again, now making his own way up the ramp. "Come on, we need to get out of here. There are more behind them. You're going to get shot if you stay." "Then let me!" the princess snapped. Leia didn't even turn to look at him that time. As each white suit fell, she just wanted to make another one do the same. Until a familiar voice called her name. Leia spun around. At first she thought she was hallucinating. Her mind had decided that Tess was either killed during torture or dragged away by the Empire, so seeing Tess at the top of the Millennium Falcon's ramp seemed nothing more than wishful. The ramp started to close, and Leia quickly jumped onto it, letting it raise her up into the ship until she was looking at Tess from level ground. They just stared at each other, neither knowing what to do. Chewbacca and Lando had turned into the cockpit to bring the ship to life and get them off Cloud City. The floor rumbled beneath them as the Millennium Falcon rose into the air. Leia and Tess remained standing over the boarding ramp. Leia noticed her stumble a bit, as she was always a bit clumsy with her flying legs. "Shouldn't you be in a seat with acceleration straps?" Leia said habitually. She only realized that she had broken the silence after the fact. Her eyes glistening with approaching tears, Tess let out a short laugh at Leia's untimely use of the question she had heard hundreds of times. This was the first time that question had not annoyed her. Tess ran forward into Leia's arms, her shoulders heaving with sobs before she even got there. The two fell to their knees, still holding the embrace, each allowing the other to cry and offering the comfort of what could only be described as the love of their unconventional family. Chapter 20, Millennium Falcon. Tess let the blue milk swirl around her cup. She watched it coat the sides, then slip down until there were only a few droplets left there. Part of her wanted to set the cup down, curl into a ball and sleep for days. Another frightening part of her wanted to throw it across the room and scream as loud as her lungs would permit her. "It was the Force, Tess," Luke explained. After carrying her inside the ship, he gently sat her down at one of the booths inside the Millennium Falcon and put a blanket over her lap. What? Tess had to have heard him incorrectly. But I can't use the Force. Jedi use the Force. I'm not a Jedi. Not yet, Luke corrected. Tess's jaw dropped. Not yet, she exclaimed. What do you mean? I'm not. Luke knelt in front of Tess and placed a friendly hand on each of her knees. He waited until he was sure that she looked directly at him. Tess, I need you to listen to what I have to say right now, okay? It's extremely important, Luke began carefully. Tess managed a slow nod, and only then did our friend continue. The Force is an energy that flows through all life in this galaxy and beyond. It has two sides, the light side and the dark side. The light side is based on wisdom, logic, and healing, but the dark side is driven by anger, selfishness, destruction, and sometimes fear. Luke took a moment to make sure Tess understood. He took her hands in his own. What you experienced in that room, it was not your fault, he explained slowly. You've not harnessed your power yet, but you will. Tess jumped to a stand. Wait, no, she blurted. I'm not like you. You are, Luke insisted, standing up as well and taking her by the shoulders. And don't worry, I can teach you how to take control of the power you have. A sudden realization stabbed Tess in the heart. He told me I was a creation. And that was not the first time I've heard people say that about me. He told me I wasn't real. I was an experiment that nobody cared about once it came out wrong, and I just wanted him to stop talking, she reflected quietly. I was more afraid and angry in that moment than I was in my entire life, and then his jaw, Her voice trailed off. Tess was terrified to ask the question on her mind. Fear. Anger. Did I use the dark side? Tess. I did, Tess snapped. Don't deny it. No. Oh no. It's not your fault, Luke insisted. Tess blurted out a laugh. Not my fault? She said with exasperation. How is ripping a man's jaw off with my magical powers not my fault? Tess, I will teach you how to control your emotions, Luke promised, taking her face in his hands so he could force her to look at him. I will teach you how to use the light side of the Force. I promise. But right now I have to go. But stay here, Luke cut her off, sitting her back down in the chair behind her. Wait here in the Falcon. Han, Leia, and Chewie will escape soon, and you can all get away from here. Luke gave Tess a kiss on the forehead and spun around to disembark the Millennium Falcon. What about you? Tess called after him worriedly. With a poise of a sort of wisdom beyond his years, Luke turned to face the girl. The Jedi's constant duty is to battle the dark side, he elucidated, be it among the outside forces or within the Jedi himself. Anger, fear, hate, the dark side. Peace, wisdom, kindness, the light side. Tess knew that her current emotions were anything but the emotions of the light side of the Force, but she tried to ignore it. If she really was Force-sensitive, that battle Luke was talking about was definitely not a tale to scare little Jedi to the light. If it was real, if Force sensitivity was the explanation she decided to believe in, then that looming dark side presence was inside of her. Tess was sitting up in what had become known as her bunk on the ship, a single bunk behind the lounge seats and the hologram board. There were also 2 triple bunk rooms on the Millennium Falcon, but they were closer to the cockpit, and things could often get loud in there. Lando Calrissian, Leia, and Chewbacca were in the cockpit as far as Tess knew. R2 was across from Tess's single bunk at the technical station, plugged into a wall to do whatever droids do. 3PO, who was only a torso and a head at this point, was powered off and secured into one of the lounge seats to prevent any further damage if they were to meet any turbulence. Normally, Tess would have made her way into the cockpit by now, but she could not imagine bearing the subtle stares from the others. Every time she caught their eyes on her, she felt an immense burden of guilt. Even though her travel companions would never say it to her face, Tess feared they blamed her for what happened to Han. If she'd only turned around as soon as she heard the danger they were in. If only she'd reached them in time. Tess may have been able to initiate a timely escape if she'd not been so stupid. A familiar Wookiee growl snapped Tess out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Chewbacca. He held up 2 stacks of Pizak cards in his huge furry hands. Haven't I taken enough of your credits? Tess smirked lightly. She appreciated Chewie's attempt to cheer her up, but she was not in the mood for it. Even though he acted friendly, Tess still feared that he had at least partially blamed her for the circumstances. As if Tess was the popular one on the Falcon today, Leia was the next to come see her. The princess gently dismissed Chewbacca, then joined Tess at the end of her bunk. I can't remember the last time I was in one of these things, Leia admitted, referring to the bunk. She glanced about the semi-alien surroundings. I normally just grab a blanket and doze off in one of the cockpit seats. It's the only place on the ship where you can't hear Han snoring. Despite the uncomfortable mentioning of the man Leia loved, the princess surprised Tess with a soft smile. The 14-year-old was not quite as strong. She lowered her eyes and picked at the bandages around her more injured wrist. Leia must have noticed her aversion. You miss him? The princess asked softly. Rather than bear another unsuccessful reassurance that their most recent marathon of horrible luck was not her fault, Tess simply nodded and played along. After all, she did miss Han. It was just not the main thing that was bothering her. I don't know how you handle it so well, Tess admitted, avoiding Leia's eyes. I mean, you two were close. More than close. You loved Luke. Tess's eyebrows shut up as she met Leia's sudden, trance-like stare. You're in love with Luke? Leia's face did not change. It froze to a blank, yet somehow a knowing expression, like something had just become unbelievably clear. Tess didn't know how to react. She interpreted the sudden clarity on her friend's face as a sudden realization of love for Luke. You are, Tess gasped. You're in love with Luke! Tess's assumption snapped Leia out of her trance that time. What? She asked, making a face at Tess as if that conclusion she reached was absurd. No, Leia corrected quickly, rising to a stand. Han. At that, the princess raced in the direction of the cockpit, with Tess following close behind. Han's in love with Luke? Leia practically plowed into the back of the pilot seat that Lando occupied, nearly prompting him to reach for his blaster in surprise. Tess had matched Leia's speed to catch up and subsequently rammed into the princess. She suddenly understood how it was not completely ridiculous for someone to run into a parked speeder. We have to go back, Leia told Lando and the Wookiee. Because Han's in love with Luke? Tess asked. Lando and Chewie sported expressions of absolute confusion. No, Leia shot back readily. Then I was right the first time, Tess concluded. You're in love with Luke? That time, Leia was the one getting stared at from their substitute pilot and the Wookiee. I am not in love with Luke, she established definitively, holding up a finger to Tess in hope of stopping any further interruptions. We have to go back, Leia repeated. I know where Luke is. She reached towards the controls as Chewbacca promptly obeyed her. A harder-to-convince Lando pushed Leia's hand away. But what about those fighters? He interrupted. Chewie looked up at the princess questioningly. The danger they faced made the Wookiee second-guess their unexpected detour. Chewie, just do it, Leia insisted. That was all the Wookiee needed, and all he had to do was growl at Lando to get their substitute pilot on board with the plan as well. Tess planted herself in the seat behind Chewie and fastened her acceleration straps. Leia did the same in the seat behind Lando. I'm in love with Han, no one's in love with Luke, the princess established quickly. Tess twisted her face into a playful wince. Wow, no one? Ouch, she's going to need a med pack for that burn. And I'm going to need a med pack for that line because that was just ridiculous. Can we just excuse that as, like, temporary insanity? That was so bad I had to break character. Okay, next chapter. Chapter 21. It was a good thing the Imperial fighters assumed that once the Falcon was gone it would not be coming back, because if they hadn't, returning to Cloud City would have been impossible. Tess watched with bewilderment as Leia directed Lando and Chewie. How did she know where Luke was? Did she just suddenly remember that they were supposed to pick him up somewhere? The latter would be the logical explanation, but Tess sensed there was something deeper going on, especially when they saw someone hanging from a weather vane at the very bottom of Cloud City. There's someone up there, Lando pointed out, as if reading Tess's thoughts. Leia stood up. Chewie, slow down, she demanded, her eyes wide. Slow down and we'll get under him. Lando, open the top hatch. Lando did as advised. Tess stood up to go help him, but Leia grabbed her arm. Luke left their area of vision as the Falcon pulled under him. Slowly but surely, they made a perfect stasis right under the weather vane. Tess felt intuitively compelled to look to the left, and her heart raced at the sight of 3 TIE fighters like the ones who chased them out of the city. Leia, Tess warned, pointing in that direction. Leia followed Tess's finger, then hurriedly grabbed the comlink. Lando? All right, let's go, came Calrissian's voice. Chewie did not waste a second. He started preparing the ship to race away. Moments later, to everyone's relief, Lando helped an injured Luke over to the cockpit. Leia jumped to a stand and ran over to embrace him. Tess kept her place, seeing that Luke needed medical attention more than another hug, but he gave her a smile over Leia's shoulder. Leia helped him down the corridor. Wielding the fastest ship in the galaxy, the group was no match for the TIE fighters. It was the Star Destroyer that caused a problem. Leia soon returned and suggested that Tess go sit with Luke. She welcomed the opportunity to escape the imminent debate over whose fault it was that lightspeed wasn't working this time around. Tess reached the doorway to the room Luke was in and heard a voice. She immediately recognized it as Luke's. At first, she suspected one of the droids was in there with him, but then she saw 3PO talking to R2 at the other side of the room, warning the little droid not to trust strange computers or something of the like. Father, Luke said. Tess figured he was hallucinating. Ben, he continued. Why didn't you tell me? Tess remembered Ben. That was Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi Master. Her curiosity preventing her from staying put, she made her way into the room. Luke, she whispered. He turned his head slightly. What were you talking about? Vader, he muttered. Tess wasn't sure she heard correctly. As if he didn't know he said that aloud, Luke shook his head slightly. Don't listen to me. I'm not making any sense. Tess gave him a look. Wincing, Luke tried to sit back up. No, Tess insisted, pushing him gently back onto the bed. You're hurt. You need to stay put. She placed a wet cloth over his forehead and couldn't help but cringe at his severed hand. Did Vader do this to you? Yes, Luke whispered, his gaze and most of his mind seemingly somewhere far away. Father. You said it again, Tess exclaimed. Luke groggily shook his head. There's still good in him, he muttered. He couldn't possibly be talking about Vader, not the man that they as rebels had come to despise. I wouldn't count on it, Tess muttered under her breath. I hate him. No, Luke snapped. After thinking he was practically unconscious at that point, his outburst made her jump. No, he repeated. Hate leads to the dark side. Luke, you need to rest, Tess reminded him. The aspiring Jedi grabbed her hand in retaliation. Tess, listen, he said seriously. I'm not a Jedi yet, but I want to train you as best I can. I want to train you in the ways of the Force. Would you want that? Completely caught off guard with the idea, Tess's jaw dropped. Force-sensitive 1 minute, Padawan the next? This was also surreal. Tess stammered. You mean like your Padawan? She let her mind catch up to her, as Luke seemed to slip further and further away from consciousness. He said nothing, but she could almost feel him tell her how much this needed to happen. Suddenly, the ship jolted into light speed, sending Tess sprawling into the wall of the small room. Yes, Tess exclaimed, as if now would be her last chance to say it. Yes, we'll do it. She pushed herself to a stand and saw that Luke finally slipped into unconsciousness. She smiled slightly. He needed the rest. I'll leave you be then, Tess whispered. Master. Chapter 22. Rebel Star Cruiser. Tess Naberrie absent-mindedly paced around the giant rebel cruiser. After 3 years of traveling on the Millennium Falcon, she was not used to the pristine look of the modern design of the ship. The fastest hunk of junk in the galaxy was attached to their cruiser by a docking tube, currently occupied by Lando and Chewbacca. Not entertained with simple pacing, Tess crossed over to watch the medical droid fix Luke's hand. The Jedi's few grimaces stopped as soon as his new Padawan was near. He and Tess glanced over to Leia, who gazed solemnly out the large window. How would you feel about keeping this a secret for now? Luke whispered to Tess. She gave him a look. Your hand?
she asked. Because the whole needly medical droid fixing your stub of an arm thing kind of gave it away. No, Luke chuckled lightly. Your training. Seeing the actual seriousness of the situation, Tess's expression hardened a bit. Lie to Leia? Leia's always worried about me because of what I can do, Luke reminded her. And she worries about you already. Can you imagine the stress of finding out that you're following this path too? A path she's so confused about? You'll be protecting her, Tess. Luke looked over to the princess once again. She has enough to worry about right now. At least until we find Han. It took her a few moments, but Tess finally nodded. Luke smiled at her and pushed himself to a stand. He squeezed the girl's hand, then led her over to Leia. Tess took a few steps ahead of Luke and placed herself to Leia's right, taking the princess's hand. Luke came to Leia's left side. He smiled softly at her, then hugged her shoulders. The three of them stood there in front of the rebel cruiser's huge window. They watched the Millennium Falcon detach itself from the docking tube and zoom off into oblivion. So much was new. Tess would soon be trained in the Force. Lando was now on their side, and with him and Chewbacca and the Falcon, they had a new arrangement of their traditional crew. Yet despite all the new, the three friends felt as if they'd known each other forever. Luke, Leia, and Tess were the same people they had been for the past 3 years, yet somehow looking at the galaxy spilled out before them, they could not deny the sense of a brand new adventure.